All right, so let's jump right in. You sent over this article. It's from Euractiv, the brief EU's AI race to the bottom. Just came out yesterday, February 20th, 2025. And it seems like things are changing. The EU has always been seen as kind of the leader when it comes to AI safety and regulation, but this article suggests they might be shifting gears.
Yeah, it's a pretty big shift. It talks about this idea of a global race to the bottom, where countries are basically saying, forget about all of the safety stuff. Let's just focus on developing AI as fast as possible.
So the EU is abandoning its role as the safety police and jumping into the fast lane. Why the sudden change of heart?
Well, the article points to a few things.
Yeah.
For one, the U.S. is investing a ton of money in AI infrastructure, like a ridiculous amount. We're talking 500 billion.
Wow, 500 billion?
Yeah, and get this, it's all privately funded,
Oh,
which is pretty amazing when you think about it.
that's a lot of cash. So
Yeah.
the US is going all in. What about other countries? Are they doing the same thing?
Pretty much, the U.K. is also really pushing AI development. They're even replacing some of their regulatory people with former tech execs, which is kind of interesting.
Interesting. How so?
Well, it just seems like they're really prioritizing the industry's perspective over maybe some of the safety concerns.
I see. So it's not just the US, it's the UK too. Anyone else?
Oh, yeah. The article mentions how India and Brazil were basically creating these regulation-free zones specifically to attract AI companies.
So it sounds like everyone is jumping on this AI bandwagon. It's like the EU is feeling the pressure to keep up.
Yeah, exactly. The article describes it as a classic prisoner's dilemma.
Oh, like the game theory thing?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Basically, everyone would be better off if they all cooperated on AI safety. But no one wants to be the first one to back down because they're afraid of falling behind.
So they're all kind of stuck in this cycle of, if I don't do it, someone else will.
Right. And it seems like the EU is realizing that they can't afford to be the only ones playing by the rules anymore.
So they're saying forget about being the gold standard.
In a way, yeah. It seems like they're prioritizing their own competitiveness over their role as the global leader on AI safety.
But hasn't the EU always been comfortable with setting the standard, even if it meant things were a little uncertain? I mean, the article even mentions that Brussels effect,
Oh, yeah.
where basically EU regulations just become the global standard, whether other countries like it or not.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it seems strange that they'd be backing away from that now.
It is a pretty big shift. You're right. For a long time, the EU was happy to kind of forge ahead into this unknown territory with AI, but now it seems like they're more concerned with just keeping up with everyone else.
So how are they doing that? What are they actually doing to speed up their AI development?
Well, one thing they're doing is pulling back on some of their regulations, like this thing called the AI Liability Directive. It was supposed to complement the EU AI Act, but they just scrapped it completely.
Hold on, I think we need to back up a second.
Mm.
For our listeners who might not be familiar with all the technical terms, could you give us a quick rundown of what the EU AI Act is? Sure. So the EU AI Act is this big piece of legislation that was supposed to regulate artificial intelligence across a bunch of different industries. It was kind of a landmark thing.
Yeah.
It was seen as a really big step towards making sure that AI development in the EU is, ethical and safe.
And now it's being thrown out.
Well, not exactly. It's not being thrown out completely,
Yeah.
but it's facing some pushback. There's talk of simplifying it, which could really weaken its impact.
So the liability directive is gone and the AI Act is being watered down. What else is happening?
Well, there's this guy, Roberto Viola.
Yeah.
He's the head of the EU's Directorate for Communications Networks, Content and Technology. And he basically confirmed that there aren't going to be any new AI regulations for the next 5 years.
5 years. But things are moving so fast in the world of AI, that's like a lifetime.
Exactly. It's a pretty clear sign that the EU is hitting the pause button on regulation.
So they're not just rolling back existing regulations, they're also pumping the brakes on anything new. So if they're not focusing on regulation, what are they focusing on?
Basically pumping money into AI development. Macron just announced $109 billion in AI investments that France has been able to attract.
Oh, okay, so France is making big moves. What about the whole EU?
Von der Leyen is pushing this $150 billion private initiative called the EU AI Champions Initiative. And there are billions more planned in public European investments on top of that.
Wow, so they're really putting their money where their mouth is. It seems like they're trying to play catch up. But this article argues that regulating something as complex and fast-moving as AI is just impractical, especially when you're trying to do it across so many different sectors. They say it just creates too much uncertainty. What do you think about that?
Well, there's definitely some truth to that. AI is moving at such a crazy pace that it's really hard for regulators to keep up. It's like trying to hit a moving target. But the question is giving up on regulation altogether really the answer?
Yeah, that's what we need to figure out. Because if the EU isn't going to be the one setting the standards, who is? And what happens if everyone just decides to go their own way?
Those are the big questions. And that's what we'll be digging into in the rest of this deep dive.
So the EU is full speed ahead on AI development and slamming on the brakes when it comes to regulation. But what happens if there are no brakes? What are some of the risks if no one is really keeping an eye on things?
Well, it's like if everyone is just focused on being the first one out the gate, who's going to make sure that AI is being used for good
Uh,
and not for bad,
yeah.
you know?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we've already seen AI being used for things like facial recognition and surveillance, which can be pretty scary when you think about it.
Exactly. And those are just the things we know about. Imagine what's happening behind closed doors.
Hmm.
You know, as AI gets more and more powerful, the potential for harm just keeps growing.
Give me an example. What kind of harm are we talking about?
Well, let's say you have an AI system that's deciding who gets a loan or who gets hired for a job, but the system is biased against certain groups of people. That could be a huge problem.
Yeah, that would be bad. Or what about those autonomous weapons systems? You know, the ones that can make decisions about who lives and who dies without any human input.
Exactly. That's the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night. You know, it's like we're creating these incredibly powerful tools, but we're not really thinking about the consequences.
It's like we're on this runaway train and there's no one at the controls.
Yeah, it's a scary thought, but it doesn't have to be that way. You know, we can still get a handle on this,
Yeah.
but it's going to take a real conscious effort to prioritize safety and ethics alongside economic growth.
So you're saying it's not just about competition, it's about finding a way for everyone to work together.
Exactly. And that's where international cooperation comes in. The article mentions that this Paris AI Summit could have been a great opportunity to really start making some progress on that front.
In what way? What could they have done differently?
Well, for one, the EU could have really pushed for all the participating countries to commit to some kind of safety framework. You know, something that would ensure AI is being developed responsibly.
So instead of just competing against each other, they could have been working together to create some kind of global AI watchdog.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
everyone would benefit from that in the long run.
But they didn't. It sounds like the EU is basically signaling that it's not willing to do that if it means potentially slowing down its own progress.
Right. And that's the problem. It's like this prisoner's dilemma that we talked about earlier.
Can you remind me what that is again? I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
Basically, it's a situation where everyone would be better off if they cooperated. But they have an incentive to cheat, you know, because they're afraid of losing out if they're the only ones following the rules.
So in this case, the prisoners are the countries developing AI, and they're all worried that if they're the only ones who are being careful about safety, they'll fall behind.
Exactly. And that's the trap that the EU seems to have fallen into. They're so worried about keeping up with everyone else that they're willing to sacrifice some of their principles.
So the EU is prioritizing its own competitiveness, even if it means potentially putting the world at risk.
That's the concern. And it's a valid one.
Yeah.
You know, we're talking about a technology that has the potential to change everything. And we need to be really careful about how we develop it.
I hear you. But is there anything positive to say about this whole situation? I mean, are there any potential benefits to the EU stepping up its AI game?
Well, if you look at it from a purely economic perspective, I guess you could argue that the EU needs to stay competitive. You know, if they fall too far behind, they could lose out on a lot of opportunities.
So it's about jobs and innovation and all that.
Right. And from that perspective, I guess you could say that this shift in strategy is a necessary evil.
Okay, so there are some potential upsides, but it still feels like we're sacrificing a lot in the process.
Yeah.
What happens to the idea of ethical AI if no one is willing to set the standards and enforce them?
That's the million-dollar question.
Hmm.
And it's one that we all need to be thinking about. You know, it's not just up to governments and corporations to figure this out.
So you're saying we all have a role to play?
Absolutely. You know, we can't just sit back and wait for someone else to fix this. We need to be informed. We need to be engaged. And we need to be willing to hold those in power accountable.
So what can everyday people do? I mean, I'm just one person. What difference can I really make?
Well, for starters, stay informed about these issues. You know, don't just tune it out because it seems complicated or overwhelming.
Okay, so knowledge is power. What else?
Talk about it.
Yeah.
You know, have conversations with your friends and family about these issues. Write to your elected officials. Let them know that you care about how AI is being developed and used.
So be vocal. Make our voices heard. Got it. Anything else?
Support organizations that are working to promote ethical AI.
Hmm.
There are a lot of great groups out there that are really trying to make a difference.
Right, so be informed, be vocal, and support ethical development sounds like a plan. But if even the EU is backing away from regulation, does that mean ethical AI is a lost cause?
I wouldn't say that. I think it just means that the fight is going to be even harder, but it's a fight worth having, you know?
Hmm.
The future of AI is not set in stone. We still have a chance to shape it, but it's going to take all of us working together.
It's like this really fundamental question, isn't it? Well, what happens when we prioritize speed and profit over safety and ethics when it comes to AI?
Yeah, and I don't think there's an easy answer. It's something we all have to think about. Because the future of AI, it's not something that just happens to us.
Well, not just passengers,
Exactly.
Mhm.
We all have a role to play. Whether we realize it or not, every choice we make, it all adds up. You know what I mean?
So we can't just sit back and expect the governments and the tech companies to sort it all out for us.
Nope. We have to be informed.
Yeah.
We have to be involved. And we have to be willing to speak up.
Hmm.
Hold those in power accountable.
So it's about individual responsibility, as much as it is about regulations and all that.
Exactly. The future of AI is too important to leave it to chance. You know what I mean? It's up to all of us to make sure it's a future we can all live with.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive. I feel like we've just scratched the surface, though.
Yeah, there's always more to learn, right? AI is changing so fast, it's hard to keep up.
For sure. Any final thoughts for our listeners as they try to navigate this crazy world of AI?
Just remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about AI, the better we'll be able to shape its future. So ask questions, challenge assumptions, and don't be afraid to demand better from the people who are building these technologies.
Well said. A huge thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Likewise, it's been great.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll catch you next time.